Elizabeth, a self-assured and lively woman, made the decision to go to an art gallery on a sunny afternoon in order to view some artwork. Elizabeth Jackson, 43-year-old community leader and seasoned civil rights activist, was born and raised in the Sacramento neighborhood of California. Her fight for justice and equality was deeply ingrained in the neighborhood's rich cultural legacy and lively streets, which served as both her haven and her battlefield. Although people moved quickly through the busy streets, Elizabeth walked with calm and purpose. She was a tall, elegant woman with dark skin that shimmered in the sunlight, and her deep brown eyes revealed an inner strength that seemed unwavering. Elizabeth wore an elegant blue dress that moved softly with the wind, her hair neatly arranged in a high bun, revealing her serene and confident face. Each step she took seemed to convey a calm yet resolute energy. She carried a simple yet sophisticated brown leather bag slung over her shoulder. Today was a special day for Elizabeth. She had heard about the new exhibition at Norby Gallery and was eager to immerse herself in art and forget the day-to-day troubles, even if just for a few hours. Since childhood, art had always been a refuge for her, a space where she could escape and connect with something larger than herself. As she approached the gallery, Elizabeth felt a surge of anticipation. The facade of the building was modern and imposing, with large glass windows that offered tempting glimpses of the artworks inside. A gentle smile appeared on her face as she imagined the paintings and sculptures waiting to be discovered. Elizabeth took one last look around before climbing the steps to the entrance. She enjoyed observing people, capturing their impressions and behaviors. There was something comforting in knowing that each person around her had their own stories, their own battles. But today, Elizabeth was ready to lose herself in the beauty and silence of the gallery, leaving the world outside for a moment. As she neared the door, she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and took a deep breath. Little did she know that what was about to happen inside the gallery would challenge her calm and test her strength in ways she could never have imagined. Elizabeth was about to enter Norby Gallery when a towering, imposing guy crossed her path. It turned out to be Henry, the gallery security guard. His well-built physique and serious demeanor, along with his immaculately made black suit, added to his intimidating appearance. Henry wore an almost militaristic pose, his arms folded across his chest, and a mistrustful expression on his face. Elizabeth froze, startled by Henry's sudden appearance. She glanced at him, curious but wary, her eyes darting back and forth between Henry and the gallery door, trying to figure out why he was in the way. Henry studied Elizabeth from head to toe, his blue eyes penetrating and almost menacing. His pale skin set off his well-groomed, short blonde hair. Without saying a word, he nodded for Elizabeth to hand up her luggage, looking bewildered. Elizabeth glanced around as more guests entered the gallery, walking past Henry with their backpacks and bags unhindered. She scowled as she attempted to understand why she was receiving different treatment. Elizabeth took a deep breath and felt a rush of indignation. She knew something was wrong, that she was being treated unfairly. "Sir, why do I have to hand over my bag?" Henry continued to look at Elizabeth without flinching. Elizabeth at last questioned, her voice laden with confusion and a hint of defiance. She felt it was necessary to express her outrage, albeit subtly. Henry did not answer right away. Instead, he held his rigid position as though considering how best to respond. Finally, in a firm and impersonal tone, he said, "It's the gallery policy, ma'am. If you want to enter, you need to hand over your bag." Elizabeth felt a twinge of rage as she turned to face the other guests who were still able to enter without restriction. She knew that arguing with Henry would probably not solve anything because he was there to perform a role, and obviously had no intention of deviating from his orders. The injustice of the situation was obvious. Why was she, a black woman, being subjected to rules that seemed to apply to no one else? With a defeated sigh, Elizabeth felt both helpless and increasingly resolved that this would not go unnoticed. After taking her backpack off her shoulder, Elizabeth gave it to Henry. She tried to remain calm and stated, "I hope this doesn't happen to anyone else." Henry took the bag without any expression of recognition or sympathy. As Elizabeth walked through the door, she couldn't help but feel that this minor victory for Henry was just the beginning of something bigger. She wondered what else awaited her inside the gallery, and how this unjust experience could shape the rest of her day. Elizabeth passed through the entrance of Norby Gallery, still trying to process what had happened. The interaction with Henry had left a bitter taste, but she was determined not to let it ruin her visit. As soon as she entered the spacious main hall, she paused for a moment to absorb the environment around her. The walls were adorned with an impressive collection of vibrant paintings, each more intriguing than the last. The high ceiling and huge windows allow natural light to flood the space, further enhancing the beauty of the displayed works. As Elizabeth slowly walked through the hall, trying to calm herself, her eyes inevitably began to observe the other visitors. There was a young couple chatting animatedly while holding an exhibition brochure. An elderly woman wearing an extravagant hat stood in front of a large painting completely absorbed. Next to her, a group of teenagers laughed and took selfies, clearly having fun. This realization made Elizabeth's stomach turn. She saw a middle-aged man entering the gallery with a large bag hanging on his shoulder without anyone stopping him. He casually waved at Henry, who responded with a nod and a friendly smile. Elizabeth noticed that none of them had been approached by Henry or any other security guard. Everyone seemed at ease, with no apparent concern for their bags or backpacks. Elizabeth scowled at this exchange, wondering why her luggage had been seen as a danger, when there was nothing unusual or menacing about the man's. Elizabeth felt a mixture of rage and sadness developing inside of her as she noticed a young blonde with a colorful backpack strolling carefree. The difference between the treatment Elizabeth had gotten and the attention given to other guests was evident. Elizabeth watched Henry for a moment, her mind racing with conflicting thoughts. Had he deliberately chosen her because of her color, or was it just an unfortunate coincidence? However, Elizabeth could not shake the unsettling feeling that she had been unfairly marked as suspicious. A strong determination was beginning to form within her as she tried to process this reality. Elizabeth wondered if she had been targeted for racial discrimination. The idea was painful, but she could not ignore the fact that she seemed to be the only one in a sea of mostly white faces. Define her visit or day by taking a deep breath and choosing to concentrate on the stunning artworks in front of her. However, after becoming aware of the injustices that were still in place, Elizabeth found it difficult to ignore them. She could feel Henry's gaze following her around like an uneasy shadow that would not go away. So she made the decision that she needed to speak with him once more in order to find out why she was the only one who had been stopped. Elizabeth took a few steps back and took a big breath before approaching Henry, who was standing close to the door, observing the guests with a watchful glance. "Excuse me, sir," Elizabeth replied. Elizabeth, attempting to maintain composure, "I'm still not sure why. When nobody else was stopped, I had to give up my bag." Henry repeated his tone in a detached, robotic manner, as if he was previously prepared for this query about the gallery rules. He gazed at her with an emotionless expression. "For security reasons, anyone entering with a large bag must leave it at the entry. However, I've seen multiple individuals enter with bags and backpacks." Elizabeth pressed, pointing to the other guests who were able to wander the exhibition at will, asking why this just applied to me. "I'm just doing my duty. Not all visitors are checked, but today I need to follow this procedure with you. It might be random, it might not be, but it's the policy, and I can't make exceptions." Henry remained impassive, his rigid expression showing no signs of empathy or flexibility. Elizabeth asked, in a calm but tremulous tone, "It's not Up to me to discuss the gallery policy, feeling her irritation building inside her. You're saying I was randomly chosen without any specific reason, she said, realizing that Henry's logic made no sense. Henry forcefully said, my role is to make sure that, if you have any complaints, you can contact the management. Elizabeth shook her head, thinking to herself, this is ridiculous. She was filled with a mixture of frustration and helplessness. Unable to see why she was being treated differently, she became even more irate at Henry's dismissive and repetitious remark. As she glanced again at the other guests strolling around carefree, it was clear that Henry was using the policy as a justification for his discriminatory behavior. Elizabeth was aware that she was not being treated equally, and she was determined to find out why. She made the decision to go to great lengths to find out why. But for the time being, she could only accept Henry's inadequate explanation and continue with her visit. As Elizabeth walked through the gallery, she tried to concentrate on the artwork around her. But the sense of discrimination was like a dark stain on her day, making it impossible to ignore the injustice of the situation, and bringing back memories of other instances when she had encountered prejudice, such as at the clothing store where the salesperson followed her around the aisles, or at school when her classmates made hurtful remarks about her skin color. Many unpleasant recollections at this time mix in the gallery. With the latest embarrassment, Elizabeth paused in front of a large abstract painting, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Anger and sadness battled inside of her, and she felt the need to scream for justice, so that those around her would know what she was going through. However, there was also a deep sadness and bitter resignation that came from realizing that racism existed even in an elegant place like an art gallery. Elizabeth looked around, hoping to find a friendly face or someone who could empathize with her. But the other patrons seemed to be unaware of her suffering, as they laughed and talked while exploring the gallery. Elizabeth felt alone, as though she were in a sea of indifference. But despite her sadness and anger, there was a fire inside of her that was determined not to let this experience define who she was. She was strong and resilient, having overcome many challenges in her life. This would just be another battle she faced with dignity and courage. Sighing deeply, Elizabeth tried to gather her thoughts. She had come to the gallery in search of inspiration and beauty, and she wouldn't let unfair treatment ruin that. Elizabeth decided to go on with her visit, take in the artwork, and find some peace, even if it was only for a short while. However, before moving on, Elizabeth realized she needed a resolution. So she went back to Henry, who was speaking with another security guard. Elizabeth approached Henry with a firm and determined expression. I'm hoping this is sufficient. Elizabeth knew her action wouldn't change Henry's view, but she felt a little relief in showing that she wasn't willing to accept discrimination passively. With her bag in hand, Elizabeth turned to the artworks, trying to remember why she had come in the first place. She knew the fight against discrimination didn't end there, but for now, she was determined to find the beauty and serenity she had come to seek. With a mixture of relief and fury, Elizabeth took slow, deliberate steps into the gallery, attempting to gather herself and concentrate on the reason she had come to see the art. An amazing collection of modern artwork, including paintings and sculptures, graced the walls of the main hall. Elizabeth paused in front of a huge abstract artwork. Elizabeth was drawn to the depth and emotion captured in the painting. She had always believed that art had the ability to transcend words, to communicate feelings that were difficult to express otherwise. As her eyes moved across the canvas, she noticed that it was full of vibrant colors entwined in complex patterns. There was also a pulsating energy in the piece, as if each brushstroke told a story. Elizabeth connected deeply with the piece. The colors and shapes seemed to capture her inner state, which was a mixture of chaos, beauty, struggle, and hope. She lost herself in the tranquility, allowing the details to envelop her and carry her to a contemplative space. As Elizabeth perused the gallery further, she came upon an intriguing sculpture. The sculpture, which was made of white marble, showed a woman in a graceful pose with her arms outstretched as though she were going to soar. Her serene look exuded a sense of freedom and peace. Elizabeth marveled at the artist's ability to convey such delicate lightness in a solid medium. She took a minute to consider the sculpture's representation of freedom, and felt that the woman's picture spoke to her own struggle for justice and freedom. As Elizabeth tried to concentrate on the artworks, she couldn't help but feel like there was someone always watching her from behind. As her unease grew, she turned slightly to confirm her suspicions. Elizabeth was inspired by the art and found strength and comfort in the pieces she admired. But this serenity would soon be broken by Henry's watchful gaze. Henry was only a few meters away, observing her every move. It was oppressive to feel like you were being watched. Although Elizabeth made an effort to ignore Henry, it was hard to ignore his presence. He moved with deliberate, solid strides, never losing sight of her, and his demeanor remained neutral. His blue eyes, however, watched Elizabeth's every motion, as though he were waiting for an opportunity to correct her. Elizabeth experienced a shiver down her spine as she entered the gallery, which had previously seemed to be a place of beauty and tranquility, but now felt stuffy. A young couple standing next to an impressionist painting glanced curiously at Henry, causing other visitors to notice the tension as well. Henry's persistent monitoring made her feel vulnerable and uneasy, as if she were being hunted. One of the teens, who had earlier been laughing, was now staring at Elizabeth with a perplexed expression. They were whispering to one another, obviously aware of the weird dynamics that were developing. In an attempt to regain control, Elizabeth stopped in front of a painting depicting a serene landscape, and tried to concentrate on the details of the trees and the sky. But Henry's constant presence behind her made it impossible for her to lose herself in the art again. The gallery now felt like a hostile place where she was treated as an intruder, even though she had done nothing wrong. Elizabeth tried to distance herself from Henry by walking to another section of the gallery, but he followed closely. She could feel the weight of his gaze with every step. The strain of Henry's constant observation grew intolerable. Elizabeth knew she had to face the situation, even though she could feel her nerves fraying. She gently turned to face Henry in an attempt to calm herself down as her annoyance mounted. "Is there a problem, sir?" Elizabeth inquired, trying to maintain her composure, as she gazed straight into Henry's eyes, asking him to explain his actions. Henry didn't think twice. "I just want to make sure that everything is in order so that the gallery is secure. I'm just enjoying the art like everyone else, so why do you keep following me?" Henry stepped forward, closing the gap between them. "It's my job to make sure there's nothing suspicious," he said. The intensity in Henry's voice caused Elizabeth to feel uneasy. Despite her best efforts, the suggestion that she might be doing something wrong was extremely unsettling. "I'm not acting improperly," Elizabeth spoke, her voice wavering a little. "You choose to follow me even though I'm only here to view the show." Henry crossed his arms, his expression unwavering. "Ma'am, it's my job to make sure the gallery is secure. If you have nothing to hide, don't worry about it." Elizabeth became enraged. Ascending, she took a long breath, trying to keep her composure in the face of mounting fury. "I'm not hiding anything," in response to Henry's crude, an obvious implication that she was a threat. Elizabeth tried to calm herself down and said, "There's no reason for you to treat me like a criminal. I'm here to see the art, and that's what I'm doing." Henry remained silent, his icy gaze fixated on Elizabeth. "You shouldn't be concerned about my presence." Elizabeth was even more frustrated by Henry's response. She felt as though she was speaking to a brick wall because of his intransigence. Elizabeth glanced around, observing other guests, observing the exchange with curiosity, and some whispering among themselves. Elizabeth knew that arguing with Henry would probably not solve anything, but it was difficult to bear the thought of being treated so unfairly just for being in that place. She felt the weight of injustice pressing down on her. But she made the decision to maintain her dignity in spite of Henry's attitude. Elizabeth eventually spoke in a forceful voice. Even though Elizabeth knew Henry would always be with her, she tried to put the conversation behind her and concentrate on the artworks. Despite her best efforts to ignore the weight of Henry's gaze, she couldn't help but feel his presence. "I hope you find someone else to follow." Elizabeth was unable to fully enjoy the performance because of her mounting pain, which was like a steady current of tension. Suddenly, she heard Henry walk quickly up behind her and speak in an authoritative tone. "Ma'am, I need you to stop. There's something wrong." Elizabeth halted and questioned. "I'm just looking at the paintings. Is that a problem?" In an attempt to contain her rage, her patience had now reached its breaking point. Henry gave her a piercing look and said, "You've been acting suspiciously since you entered here. I need to make sure that you're not doing anything inappropriate." Elizabeth was taken aback and asked, "What do you mean? I haven't done anything but look at the art like everyone else." Henry didn't seem to believe her, and she continued to move around strangely, looking around as if you're trying to avoid being observed. That's typical behavior of someone planning something. Elizabeth couldn't believe what she was hearing, and her face heated up in indignation as she looked around. "That's not suspicious. That's normal." But Henry seemed determined not to back down. Elizabeth had a rush of powerlessness and frustration. She looked around the other guests, hoping to find some support. But most were just observing from a distance, with expressions of interest or uneasiness. "I'm not a threat," she responded, despite the fact that Henry's claims were totally baseless. Elizabeth attempting to remain composed. "It is my intention to enjoy the art, and you are treating me unfairly for that." Elizabeth felt a mixture of despair and rage as she left Henry. Henry simply shook his head, his expression remaining unaltered. "If you have nothing to conceal, there's no need to worry about being observed. Just continue your visit and know that I will be keeping an eye on you." She attempted to refocus on the paintings, but the feeling of being regarded like a suspect wouldn't go away because of the unfair charges and ongoing surveillance. Elizabeth tried to focus on another piece of art, a large canvas covered in colorful geometric shapes that seemed to dance as her eyes moved over them. But Henry's constant presence made it impossible for her to appreciate the beauty around her. She felt his gaze like a shadow that wouldn't go away. The injustice of the situation kept pulsing in her mind, making it difficult for her to find any joy in the art around her. A few minutes later, Henry came over again, looking even more serious. "Ma'am, I need you to come with me," he stated in a stern voice. "We have reason to believe you might be trying to steal something." Elizabeth was astounded, saying, "Steal me? You must be kidding." She struggled to hide her shock, saying, "I haven't even touched anything." Henry remained unwavering. "You were moving suspiciously close to a few of the artworks, so we need to make sure you're not attempting to grab anything." Henry's remarks felt like a gut punch. Elizabeth's breath became labored from wrath, and her heart began to race. It was intolerable that she was implied to be a thief in the absence of any proof. "I'm only here to view the displays. You have no right to accuse me of stealing without providing any evidence," Elizabeth retorted, her voice quivering with fury. Henry appeared unaffected. "Come with me so we can make sure the gallery is secure. If you have nothing to conceal, you shouldn't object to a check." Elizabeth had a feeling of hopelessness and despair. She knew that if she refused, Henry's baseless accusations would only become stronger, yet it was unacceptable to treat someone like a criminal when they had done nothing wrong. Elizabeth muttered, looking around again in the hopes that someone would step in. But the other guests were just observing, some with surprised looks, others obviously uncomfortable with the situation. Elizabeth tried to maintain her composure as she followed Henry, feeling the tension and humiliation grow with every step. Elizabeth knew she was being treated unfairly and discriminatorily, and the pain of that reality was nearly unbearable. But even in the midst of her sadness and frustration, she kept her head held high, determined not to let this experience break her spirit. Elizabeth had reached her breaking point. Every encounter with Henry seemed to exacerbate her sense of injustice, and she knew she needed assistance from someone. With more authority, Elizabeth inhaled deeply before turning to face Henry. "I have to talk to the person in charge of this," Elizabeth said, in a forceful, resolute voice. "I want to speak with the gallery manager or curator right now," Elizabeth insisted. "I'm just doing my job." "But," Henry glanced at her with contempt, obviously displeased. "That's unacceptable. You'll have to wait until someone from management is available," he said. Elizabeth answered, drawing the attention of a few people around her, with a voice that was just barely loud enough to say, "You are treating me unfairly, and I won't accept this without speaking to someone in charge." She then called the curator, Bruce, after a brief period of hesitation during which he assessed Elizabeth's resolve. Henry took his radio and muttered some incoherent words. A few minutes later, a sophisticated woman entered the main hall. As Elizabeth waited, her gaze never leaving Henry, she could feel the weight of her determination building, an inner force pushing her to seek justice. Olivia, the curator of the exhibition, wore a gray suit that radiated professionalism and had a sophisticated, self-assured demeanor. She approached Elizabeth and Henry with firm, determined movements. "What appears to be the issue here is that Olivia," the curator of this gallery said in a composed yet authoritative tone. Elizabeth moved forward, a glimmer of hope appearing in her eyes. "My name is Elizabeth, and I have been treated terribly badly ever since I came here. I was made to give up my bag, and now, being falsely accused of trying to steal and acting suspiciously." With a nod, Olivia turned from Elizabeth to Henry and said, "Let's resolve this." She then followed him to a more secluded spot, so they could talk about this more calmly. Elizabeth gave a nod and trailed along. Olivia is anxious for a chance to address this matter and pursue justice. Olivia led Elizabeth to a tiny meeting room at the rear of the gallery. The room had a sense of distinction and history because of the framed pictures of previous exhibitions hanging on the walls. Rada motioned for someone to have a seat, gesturing to one of the leather chairs that surrounded the polished wooden table in the middle of the space. After expressing her gratitude, Elizabeth took a seat on the other side of the table and began organizing her thoughts. Henry stayed in his alert, standing near the door. "Elizabeth, could you explain me exactly what happened?" Olivia requested in a gentle but forceful tone. "I'm curious as to what caused you to feel so abused." Elizabeth inhaled deeply before beginning. "When I got to the gallery, Henry greeted me right away and told me I couldn't get in unless I turned in my bag. I asked why this only applied to me, and he simply reiterated that it was gallery policy. Other people were entering with bags and backpacks without any problems." Olivia listened carefully, her expression a mask of focus. Elizabeth went on to say that Henry followed her around, even after she turned up her purse, which made her feel uneasy and suspicious. "He provided me no specific explanation for his monitoring, only the accusation that I was acting suspiciously, because all I was doing was appreciating the artwork, just like everyone else in the room." Elizabeth hesitated, trying to control the flood of emotion building in her voice. "And then he ordered me to go with him on a search, which is an unjustified humiliation, and accused me of trying to steal something." "I understand," Olivia finally said in a calm voice. "And Henry, what do you have to say about this?" Henry straightened even more. "If that was possible, as I said before, I was just doing my duty. I noticed Elizabeth acting in a way I considered suspicious and followed the gallery security procedures." Rada was slowly taking in everything Elizabeth said, and her eyes moved to Henry, who remained silent, as if waiting for his turn to speak. Henry stated sternly, and Olivia kept a straight face, but showed some anxiety in her eyes. As she turned to face Elizabeth and considered how to reconcile the divergent viewpoints in front of her. Taking a long breath and gathering her thoughts, Olivia turned to face Henry. After Elizabeth, she knew she had to handle the matter with tact, but also with the firmness required to keep the gallery in order. Olivia made her first statement in a kind but firm voice. I want you to know that, despite your frustration and regret that you felt discriminated against, we do not intend to treat our guests unfairly in any way. Elizabeth looked at Olivia, her eyes still full of questions and pain, as she awaited an explanation or something to make sense of the treatment she had received. Henry is here to ensure the security of the gallery. Olivia went on, we have strict policies in place to protect the artworks and make sure everyone who visits is safe. Sometimes this means we have to take drastic measures, but sometimes those steps are necessary to prevent incidents. Elizabeth gently shook her head. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't touch any artwork or do anything that would make me worthy of being treated like a criminal. But she was finding it hard to accept what she was hearing. Olivia nodded, indicating her understanding. I know you came here to admire the art, but Henry has to evaluate situations quickly and take appropriate action to safeguard the gallery. He saw certain behaviors that, in his opinion, called for greater caution. Olivia defended Henry's behavior as he maintained his stiff posture and showed no emotion. Elizabeth had an increasing surge of annoyance. It seemed as though no one was acknowledging the fact that she was receiving unfair and discriminatory treatment. Olivia went on, we have to trust the judgment of our security personnel. They are trained to recognize potential threats and take appropriate action. Henry was behaving in accordance with the procedures we had set up for any circumstances he thought would be dangerous. Elizabeth tried to control her rage. But how can you explain that I am the only one being followed and accused here when there are many of other people carrying bags and backpacks, and none of them were stopped? How fair is that? Olivia let out a small sigh. I recognize your perspective, Elizabeth. Although it may not seem fair, and I apologize if you feel this way, everyone's safety is our top priority. And occasionally that requires us to take precautionary action. Elizabeth could feel the wall of excuses that was enveloping her. It was obvious that Olivia and Henry were defending their conduct in the name of security. Elizabeth realized that her words would not alter their perspective, but she was determined to keep fighting for justice. Elizabeth stated that it's not just about security. Her voice quivered a little from passion. It's about not being the target of unfair prejudice. It's about being treated with respect and dignity. When Olivia did speak, it was with a calm, authoritative voice. That said, I will speak with Henry and review the situation in more detail. But for now, we need to follow our procedures. Olivia seemed to be thinking about what Elizabeth had said. Olivia hesitated, unsure of how to handle the sensitive situation at hand. She realized she had to strike a balance between supporting her team and acknowledging Elizabeth's valid worries. Olivia started speaking in a composed and commanding manner. I want you to know that our first focus is keeping the gallery secure. Henry is taught to recognize and react to actions that could endanger the artworks and guests. Elizabeth glanced at Olivia, her eyes still filled with grief and curiosity. I know security is important, but that doesn't excuse the treatment I had. I was followed and falsely accused without cause. Olivia gently nodded while displaying a worried look. It may seem unjust, but it is our responsibility to take all appropriate safety measures. Henry was merely carrying out his obligation to safeguard the gallery. Elizabeth expressed her continued disbelief, asking how someone who has done nothing wrong can be regarded to be doing his duty by being followed and humiliated. Olivia continued to stare. Steady security is not always an exact science, so occasionally we must act quickly, based on our intuition and judgment. If Henry sensed something was off, he took the appropriate action to guarantee everyone's safety. Elizabeth experienced a knot rising in her throat as the rat's defense sounded like an empty echo, providing a justification for actions she knew to be bad, even if there was nothing wrong. Elizabeth argued that all I was doing was looking at the artwork like everyone else. Olivia appears remorseful in a gentle way. I'm sorry Elizabeth feels this way, but we have to trust the judgment of our security personnel, since they work to keep everyone safe, even if that occasionally requires them to make tough choices. Elizabeth sensed that her tolerance was wearing thin, so she had to make the difficult choice to pursue and degrade an innocent person's security. Olivia made an effort to maintain her composure as Elizabeth's rage increased. It's crucial for all visitors to realize that security frequently entails precautionary measures that they may not fully comprehend at the time. But we are working hard to safeguard the gallery and its artworks. Elizabeth was aware that arguing would not solve anything. As Rada concluded her defense of Henry's actions, the security guard himself stepped forward, breaking up the tension between Elizabeth and the curator. "Ma'am," Henry said, in a cold, collected voice, "we need to conduct a check to ensure you are not carrying anything inappropriate." It was clear that Olivia was more concerned with defending her team's actions than acknowledging the injustice that had been committed. Elizabeth said to Henry, "I can't believe this. You really want to search me without any reason?" As she glanced at him with a mixture of disbelief and wrath, Elizabeth experienced a surge of humiliation as Henry continued to keep his detached face. It's common procedure in circumstances when there are suspicions of regular behavior. We just want to make sure that everything is in order. The thought of becoming the target of an encroaching search without any proof of guilt nearly broke her. She turned to Olivia, hoping for some encouragement, but the curator only nodded, as though acknowledging the necessity of the process. "It's unbelievable that this is occurring," Elizabeth muttered, her voice trembling with feeling. "You have no right to treat me this way, even if I haven't done anything wrong." Henry took a step forward and assumed an even more commanding stance. "If you have nothing to conceal, just cooperate and this will be taken care of swiftly." With a heavy sigh, Elizabeth gave in to Henry's request, determined to maintain her dignity in spite of the injustice, even though she felt her hands tremble with anger and frustration at being treated like a suspect. She knew that resisting would only make the situation worse. Elizabeth firmly stated, "If this is what it takes to prove my innocence, then fine. But I want to be clear that I am protesting this." Henry nodded, signaling for her to follow him to a more quiet location where the search would take place. Elizabeth continued with her head held high, knowing that she would not allow this injustice to destroy her spirit. She was committed to fighting against it and pursuing justice in any manner that she could. The tiny conference room had a strained mood. Elizabeth was still processing the humiliation of being searched while seated in one of the leather recliners. Henry remained near the door, his arms crossed and his expression firm. As Olivia stood in silence, seemingly pondering how to handle the situation, suddenly, the door clicked shut, and a tall, burly man, James, the head of security at the gallery, entered the room. His dark blue uniform was adorned with emblems that indicated his position of authority as a security officer. James's serious expression and his brown eyes quickly assessed the scene. "Good afternoon," James said, his deep voice filling the room with his deep voice. "I'm informed that there's a problem here." "What's going on?" Olivia stood up, gesturing to James to join them. "James, thank you for arriving so promptly. This is Elizabeth," she added, waving at Elizabeth. "It appears that there was a miscommunication. Henry is worried about her actions, therefore we want to make sure that everything is settled properly." Henry glanced to James, who nodded and kept his demeanor serious as he prepared to share his point of view. Elizabeth was observed acting suspiciously, and in spite of our efforts to elucidate the circumstances, she has refused to fully comply with our security protocols, Henry stated firmly. James nodded again, taking in the information. Then, He turned to face Elizabeth, who was making a lot of effort to maintain her composure. "Ma'am, I need your cooperation so we can resolve this quickly," Henry added, not waiting for more information or a thorough explanation of Elizabeth's circumstances. Elizabeth inhaled deeply as she struggled to muster the courage to explain her circumstances. "James, I came here to enjoy the art, but ever since I walked in, I've received unfair treatment. Henry forced me to turn in my bag, followed me around the gallery, and now he's accusing me of trying to steal something that I haven't even touched." James looked at Elizabeth the entire time, but he didn't appear to be paying attention. Instead, he just nodded as if he were going along with protocol. "I get it, ma'am," James answered, "but we must adhere to our protocols." Without genuinely demonstrating empathy or interest in what she had to say, Elizabeth felt a wave of fury. There was nothing unusual. "He's treating me like a criminal for no reason. Are you even listening to me?" James remained unresponsive. "If Henry saw something suspect, it's our responsibility to investigate." Elizabeth could feel her anger rising inside her. James's stance was rigid, and it was clear that he had already formed an opinion about the situation, completely ignoring Elizabeth's protests. "I am listening, ma'am, but we have to consider all aspects of security. Henry is an experienced guard, and I trust his judgment. Now, we need to proceed with the check to ensure everything is in order." As James spoke, it was evident that unconscious biases were affecting his assessment. He did not view Elizabeth as an innocent guest who was being falsely accused, but rather as a potential threat. Elizabeth made one final attempt, even though she knew it would be impossible to alter his viewpoint no matter what she said. James didn't say anything, only shook his head. "Ma'am, we have to ensure security. If you cooperate, this will be resolved quickly. All I want is to be treated fairly. You are accusing me without reason. This is not right." Elizabeth attempted to intervene, but James raised his hand to silence her. "If you haven't done anything wrong, then you should have no problem with being searched. But until we can confirm that, we need to proceed with caution." Elizabeth felt a wave of despair. "I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just here to see the exhibitions. You are treating me unfairly without any proof or reason." James looked at Elizabeth, his expression hard and unyielding. As if he were convinced that Elizabeth was guilty, James refused to budge. "If you have nothing to conceal, helping with the search will speed up the process of getting the facts straight. Our job is to stop issues before they arise. I understand that you're concerned, but we must follow our protocols to ensure the safety of the gallery." James persisted in trying to sound conciliatory while failing to disguise his authoritative tone. It was painfully obvious that he was more concerned with adhering to strict protocol than with listening to or taking into account Elizabeth's perspective. Elizabeth shook her head in frustration. "You see, this is about more than just following protocol. It's about how you've handled me from the start. I've been treated like a suspect without cause, which is unjust and dehumanizing." James's expression stayed unwavering. "Ma'am, we must take into account all security-related factors, and to ensure that everything is safe, we must follow through on Henry's suspicions. If he saw anything unusual, your participation will be crucial to our ability to handle this situation swiftly and amicably." James folded his arms and continued to stare at Elizabeth. "Our responsibility is to safeguard the artworks and the tourists, which occasionally requires us to take drastic actions. If you cooperate, though, this will be taken care of right away." Elizabeth made an effort to maintain her composure, but it was difficult not to feel a profound sense of powerlessness. Because of the way James presumed her guilt without taking into account her innocence. Elizabeth had experienced prejudice on many occasions in the past, so she knew she had to fight for her dignity and not allow these unfair assumptions to break her. Elizabeth was approached by James, who spoke in a firm voice and with an authoritative presence that dominated the room. I need you to accompany me to a separate room so we can do a search. And make sure you aren't carrying anything that would jeopardize the security of the gallery." Elizabeth had a surge of embarrassment. The thought of being the target of an intrusive search without a warrant was nearly intolerable. She glared at James, her ire and resolve pouring through her eyes. "You don't have the right to treat me like this. This is an invasion of privacy," Elizabeth said to James. "I haven't done anything to warrant this," James said, maintaining his firm demeanor. "This is typical procedure in situations where improper behavior is suspected. If you have nothing to conceal, you should have no trouble participating." Elizabeth inhaled deeply while attempting to control her rage. "Since I haven't done anything wrong, it is unfair and dehumanizing that you are blaming me without providing any evidence." With a stern, quiet voice, James moved to the front of the gallery to assure everyone's safety. "If you cooperate now, this may be settled swiftly. If not, we'll have to take more drastic actions." Elizabeth felt a knot rise in her throat. The thought of being treated like a criminal for no apparent reason was upsetting. But she knew that opposing James's request would only make things worse. So she sighed and agreed to his request, determined to maintain her dignity in the face of injustice. Elizabeth spoke in a forceful voice. "I'll accompany you, but I wanted to make it obvious that I'm protesting since this is an infringement on privacy and a misuse of authority." James gave a nod, signaling for her to follow him. The room was small, with white walls and a single large mirror, reflecting the anxiety on Elizabeth's face. He took Elizabeth down a narrow corridor to the little room at the rear of the gallery. "Please lay your hands against the wall and keep your feet apart." James spoke in a chilly, robotic voice, saying, "This won't take long." Elizabeth was filled with rage, but she obeyed James's request anyway. Pressing her hands up against the wall, and taking a deep breath to attempt to remain composed, James started the search, moving firmly and methodically. As he examined every pocket and fold of her clothes in an effort to find evidence to support his allegations, Elizabeth bit her lip to contain the tears that threatened to fall. After what seemed like a lifetime, seeing every touch as an invasion, and every movement of Char as a stinging reminder of the humiliation and injustice she was experiencing. With a tone that seemed almost dejected, James finally took a step back and stated, "You're clear. At this point, you can turn around." Elizabeth turned slowly, attempting to maintain her composure. Elizabeth muttered, "I told you I wasn't hiding anything. You had no right to treat me like this." James didn't answer. Instead, he simply shook his head and moved on, as if the search was just another item on his list of things to do for Elizabeth. Despite this, Elizabeth was determined not to let the experience define her, and she straightened her clothes, raised her head, and got ready to face the rest of the day with the same dignity and strength she always carried with her. He glanced at Henry, who was waiting near the door, and nodded. "I didn't find anything," James said in a tone that barely concealed his frustration. Elizabeth felt a wave of relief mixed with the lingering pain of the humiliation she had endured. The search had turned up nothing, but it did not lessen the weight of the injustice she felt. She looked at James and Henry, her gaze defiant even as she struggled to remain calm. Henry frowned, but he did not seem surprised. He looked at Elizabeth with disdain, as if he were still convinced of her guilt. "Very well," he said, his voice dripping with skepticism. "Let us check her bag." Elizabeth spoke in a stern but emotionally tremulous tone. "I was upfront with you and said I hadn't done anything wrong." Simply shrugging as though her comments meant nothing, James answered, "We're just doing our duty, ma'am," in a tone that implied he was merely going along according to protocol, even though Elizabeth was aware that her words would probably have no effect on them. She felt a tiny glimmer of hope that the search had turned up nothing to confirm their suspicions. Elizabeth was determined to maintain her dignity in the face of such injustice. As she attempted to gather herself, after Henry took her bag out of its storage, he turned to face James, who nodded, allowing him to start the inspection. As they were ready to go through her things, Elizabeth had a fresh wave of worry. She knew she was innocent, but the thought of yet another breach of privacy was debilitating. With a purposeful, almost ceremonial gesture, James took Elizabeth's bag, set it on the table in the tiny space, and gently opened it. Elizabeth, her eyes fixated on James's hands as he began going through her stuff, watched in a mixture of fear and rage as he carefully took out each item from the bag: a paperback book, a notebook, a wallet, and a little makeup pouch. Every item was carefully inspected before being placed aside with each motion. Elizabeth saw that her privacy was being violated, and her shame at being treated like a criminal without cause was intensifying. After opening Elizabeth's wallet and going through each compartment, as though he was expected to discover something hidden, James closed it and put it away, continuing to explore the bag. Henry observed intently, his gaze never straying from the bag as James worked. Suddenly, James stopped and lifted a small object from the bottom of the bag, holding it between his fingers with a triumphant expression. Elizabeth looked at the object in confusion. It was a gold ring that was obviously expensive and something she had never seen before. "That's not mine," she said, her voice full of incredulity. "I've never seen that before." James shook his head, his gaze fixed on Elizabeth. "This ring was in your bag, ma'am." How do you explain that? Elizabeth felt her heart race. "I know it's not mine," she said, trying not to panic. With a look of contempt on his face, Henry walked forward. "Of course, ma'am, the usual story, but this ring was in your bag, and you need to explain how it got there," Henry said. With a wave of despair, Elizabeth realized that even though she hadn't placed the ring in the bag, its presence was being used against her. It felt like everything was crumbling around her, the injustice of the situation bearing down on her. Elizabeth looked at the ring, her voice trembling with emotion, knowing that it wasn't hers. But now, she had to prove her innocence in front of everyone who seemed to already be convinced of her guilt. "I don't know how this got into my bag," Elizabeth said, her voice shaking with emotion. Henry and James exchanged a suspicious look. Expressions. "Ma'am, it's very convenient to say that now that James has spoken in a harsh and accusing manner. The tell, Elizabeth, is that the ring was in your bag." Elizabeth was getting more and more frustrated. She said, "I don't know how it got into my bag. Maybe someone put it there, but you have to believe me's not mine." Henry moved up. "Ma'am, you're in a tough situation. If the ring wasn't yours, how did it get into your bag? Are you implying that someone intentionally placed it there?" He crossed his arms over his chest. Elizabeth turned to Henry and said, "Yes, exactly what I'm saying. Someone put it in my bag to incriminate me. I don't know who or why, but that's the only logical explanation." Her rage turned to steely determination. "That's a very severe claim, ma'am. You're saying someone planted evidence against you? Why would someone do that?" Elizabeth felt a lump rise in her throat, but she knew she had to argue for her innocence. James shook his head, obviously doubtful. "I don't know who would do that, but I do know that I'm not a thief. I came here to view the art, and now I'm being falsely accused. This has to be thoroughly looked into." Henry seemed to be waiting for James to decide what to do. James was silent for a minute, considering his next move. Ultimately, James took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "We're going to need to take this to the police, so they can investigate this further and determine if your claims are valid. Until then, you'll have to come with us." Elizabeth could see the internal struggle on his face, as he considered whether to press the accusation, or to consider the possibility that she was telling the tale. Elizabeth experienced a heavy burden. The thought of being brought to the police station and treated like a criminal was nearly intolerable. But she knew she had to maintain her composure and defend her innocence. "I'll do everything it takes to prove my innocence. But you're making a terrible mistake," she stated in a stern voice. James gave a nod, signaling for her to follow him. Elizabeth was being led by James and Henry through the gallery corridors, with a sense of despair and injustice weighing heavily on her chest. Suddenly, her phone started vibrating inside the pocket of her coat. Elizabeth stopped abruptly, her eyes widening at the familiar sound of her phone. Elizabeth adjusted her posture, lifted her head, and prepared to face the next challenge. Elizabeth muttered, startled. With a frustrated expression on his face, James nodded and replied, "Be quick." Elizabeth crossed her arms, took the phone out of her pocket, and saw the name on the screen, that of the mayor's assistant, with whom she was to have a crucial meeting that day on a new civil rights initiative Elizabeth was leading. Elizabeth answered the call with shaky hands. "Hi there." Elizabeth claimed that the mayor's assistant seemed frightened and hurried, and she was attempting to stay calm on the other end of the telephone. Elizabeth was briefly relieved to hear the familiar voice, but she was worried that you hadn't arrived for the meeting. "Where are you, Elizabeth?" "I'm in the floral gallery," she said, her voice still tense. "I'm being accused of stealing. There's a major miscommunication." Elizabeth was talking on the phone when the mayor's assistant halted, obviously realizing the seriousness of the issue. "Remain calm, Elizabeth. I'll inform the mayor immediately. We'll get this resolved." All of that was about to change drastically, though. As soon as Elizabeth ended the call and looked at James and Henry, who appeared even more perplexed than before, Olivia, who had quietly approached during the conversation, observed the situation with a confused look. "Who is that on the phone?" Henry and James exchanged puzzled looks, clearly not realizing Elizabeth's true importance. Olivia inquired in an attempt to comprehend what was going on. Elizabeth inhaled deeply and decided it was time to come clean about who she really was. "Mayor's assistant. I have a meeting with him planned for today regarding a significant civil rights project that I'm spearheading." So we exchanged anxious looks. James and Henry. Olivia's attitude went from surprise to outrage over civil rights. Elizabeth nodded, feeling her strength returning. Olivia repeated, trying to comprehend the information. "That you work with the mayor?" "Yes, I am a civil rights activist, and I was here to unwind before my meeting. But I have been treated unfairly and humiliatingly since I arrived." Clearly frightened by the revelation, Henry took a step back and tried to speak, but his words didn't seem to come out. James, meanwhile, made an effort to remain composed, even though it was clear that things were spiraling out of control. Olivia, on the other hand, appeared to be battling her own inner turmoil. She had previously supported Henry and James's actions, but now she had to face the fact that they had made a serious error. "Elizabeth," Olivia started to tremble. "When I didn't know who you were, but it shouldn't have mattered." Elizabeth interrupted, raising her hand. "It doesn't matter who I am or who I work with. I should have been treated with respect and dignity, like anyone else, and I wasn't." James stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Ma'am, we were just doing our job." The tension in the room increased as Elizabeth's phone rang again. She quickly answered, hoping for an update on the situation. It was the mayor's assistant again, but this time, her voice was calm and assured Elizabeth, "The mayor is in contact with the city sheriff. He's on his way to resolve this. You will be released immediately." Elizabeth experienced a profound wave of relief as she answered, "Thank you," her voice nearly breaking with emotion. She picked up the phone, turned to face Olivia, and added, "You no longer have the right to detain me. The mayor is sending the sheriff to handle this." Olivia said nothing, obviously disturbed by what had happened. James finally groaned and stepped aside, lifting his hands in a surrender motion. He seemed caught between sticking to his authoritative attitude and allowing the inevitable higher intervention. "All right," James muttered in a quiet voice. "You're free to go. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding." Elizabeth stared at him, still shocked at how quickly things had turned around. She straightened her coat in an attempt to restore her composure and started to walk out the door. "Thank you, but this wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was an example of prejudice and power abuse, and that has to be acknowledged. Olivia moved to speak, but Elizabeth interrupted her. Regardless matter who they are or what company they work for, I hope you all take a moment to reflect on what transpired here today, and resolve to treat everyone with the respect they deserve. After the chaotic turn of events at the Norby Gallery, news of the injustice committed against Elizabeth quickly reached the ears of local authorities. The following day, the gallery was once again full. But this time, the excitement was not brought on by the artworks in one of the meeting rooms. Elizabeth held her head high, feeling stronger than before, as she walked out of the gallery. She knew that this painful experience had only strengthened her resolve to fight against injustice and prejudice in all its forms. Awaiting the commencement of a conference they knew would have dire consequences, James and Henry sat. Public attorney, a middle-aged guy named Dr. Benjamin, entered the room with a determined yet disapproving look on his face. He took his place at the head of the table. Crossing his arms, he watched the 3 gallery staff members standing next to him. The city sheriff was a tall, strong man, with an expression that said he was there to make sure justice was done. "Good morning, Doctor," Benjamin said, in a firm voice that filled the room. "We are here to discuss the behavior you exhibited towards Mrs. Elizabeth yesterday. What happened was a clear demonstration of discrimination and abuse of power," he said. "Every one of you acted in a way that violated not only Elizabeth's rights, but also the fundamental principles of respect and equality that we must uphold." Olivia tried to interrupt, but Benjamin raised his hand to silence her. With embarrassment visible in their faces, James and Henry lowered their gazes. Olivia, though, maintained her composure despite obviously finding it difficult. Olivia Benjamin persisted in going straight to the curator. "As the head of this gallery, you were supposed to make sure that every guest was treated with respect and decency. But instead, you justified and encouraged the acts of your staff without checking the veracity of their claims." Olivia bit her lip and spoke at last. "I was merely adhering to security protocols because I never wanted anyone to suffer unfair treatment." Benjamin turned to James and Henry, shaking his head in disappointment. "You have a duty to protect the rights and dignity of all visitors. Following procedures should never be an excuse for discrimination," he said. His sharp eyes focused on them. "Henry James, your actions were wholly inappropriate. You let your prejudices guide you, which led to the public humiliation of an innocent person without cause or justification. This is not just a failure on a professional level, but also a moral one." Henry appeared prepared to explain himself, but Benjamin's remarks silenced him. "There are no excuses for what you did. Discrimination and the abuse of power are unacceptable in any situation. You not only failed to protect the gallery's security, but also fundamental human rights." The public defender took a moment to make sure his comments registered. "This behavior will have serious consequences. The incident will be documented as a serious violation of gallery policies and civil rights. Anticipate a comprehensive investigation and suitable remedial measures." Benjamin immediately moved aside to make room for Elizabeth, who was waiting to speak in front of the door. Elizabeth had a composed demeanor, but her eyes glowed with the resolve of someone who was prepared to demand justice. "I had anticipated a quiet moment of introspection when I entered the Norby Gallery yesterday." But Elizabeth moved forward, her gaze unwavering and hard. Feeling the tension of the room with all eyes on her, she took a big breath and started speaking. Elizabeth stopped, allowing her words to reverberate in the hushed room. Her tone was loaded with restrained emotion. "But instead, I was confronted with skepticism, embarrassment, and prejudice. What occurred to me is a human rights issue as well as a case of professional misconduct. Due to the fact that I am a black woman in an area where it seems like my presence is not accepted, I was treated like a suspect who has been judged before even knowing why." Elizabeth's voice began to steady more as she spoke, explaining that this incident is a reflection of a larger issue that many people deal with on a daily basis. Prejudice and discrimination are realities that many of us deal with on a regular basis, often without any explanation other than the color of our skin or how we look. Elizabeth turned to face Olivia, James, and Henry. Her eyes gleamed with a combination of resolve and sorrow. You used your position of power to treat me unfairly and with contempt, instead of treating everyone with the decency and respect they deserve. You let your preconceptions guide your behavior. As Elizabeth talked, the room seemed to close around her, burdened by the weight of her experiences and the urgency of her message. Nobody else should have to go through what happened yesterday. Systemic improvements are required, as is a sincere dedication to justice and equality. She paused, her voice full of emotion, saying that everyone who visits this gallery or any other place should be treated with respect, regardless of who they are or how they look. Elizabeth looked around, her eyes gleaming with profound conviction. I demand that you listen to me, because I am not just a victim of discrimination. I am a voice for those who are frequently silenced. And I am here to make sure that my voice and the voices of many others are heard. Olivia, I demand that James, Henry, and everyone in a position of authority reflect deeply on how their behavior and demeanor impact others. You must also make a commitment to improving. Following Elizabeth's speech, the room fell silent for a moment, as everyone took in the depth of what she had to say. She concluded with a firmness that reverberated throughout the room. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it, and we can and must fight for a future where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. After hearing Elizabeth's statements, Olivia, James, and Henry were clearly shaken, as they considered the consequences of their acts in the new context. Public Attorney Dr. Benjamin broke the silence, speaking in a firm and authoritative tone. He said, "What Elizabeth said is true. Each of us has the responsibility to treat others with respect and dignity. When we fail in that, we need to face the consequences." He turned to face Olivia, the curator of the gallery, who was sitting quietly and shaking her hands. As the curator, you should be the example of leadership and integrity instead of allowing discrimination to go unnoticed and justifying actions that should never have been taken. Your failure to act appropriately not only harmed Elizabeth, but also damaged the reputation of the gallery. You lead. Olivia nodded slowly, showing signs of shame on her face. I swear that this won't occur once more. I'll do my best to make sure that our gallery is a welcoming and respectful environment. Benjamin turned to face James, who was standing and attempting to remain composed. As the head of security, James, you have a responsibility to protect everyone, not just the artwork. Your prejudice and snap decision clearly abused your authority. Therefore, you must critically evaluate how you carry out your duties and get further training in ethics and human rights. James nodded to acknowledge the gravity of his actions. Yes, sir, he responded in a calm yet firm voice. And I'm willing to go through any training that's required, so that this won't happen again under my supervision. Lastly, Benjamin turned to face Henry, who appeared even more uneasy in the circumstance. Henry, your actions were blatantly discriminatory. You acted with prejudice, and that is unacceptable. You must realize that everyone who enters this gallery deserves respect and equality. Your security procedures will be thoroughly reviewed, and your job will be reevaluated. Henry nodded, his face displaying remorse and resolution. I understand, he added, speaking in a barely audible whisper. I'm going to improve so that this doesn't happen again. Benjamin averted his eyes and looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you have displayed incredible bravery and self-control in the face of severe injustice. Your remarks serve as a reminder to us of the significance of pursuing justice and equality, and we will make sure that your advice is not ignored. There will be steps made to guarantee that this gallery, and all of its employees adhere to these values. Elizabeth nodded, thanking Dr. Benjamin, with a gleam of optimism in her eyes. I'm hoping this is a start in the right direction. The public defense nodded. Not just for me, but for everyone who might experience similar abuses. We will take decisive action. The meeting came to an end, but the impact of Elizabeth's words and Benjamin's actions lingered in everyone's minds. It was the start of a necessary change, and everyone realized that their responsibilities went beyond words to include actions that would shape the future. This gallery will become an example of how to learn from our mistakes and how to create an environment of true equality and respect. With a mixture of relief and resolve, Elizabeth left the small meeting room. Her meeting with the public defender had been intense, but essential for realizing the injustice that had been done. As she moved through the gallery's hallway, the artwork that had once promised tranquility now served as a backdrop for her pursuit of justice. As she got closer to the front desk, Elizabeth paused for a moment, gripping the bag firmly, reflecting on everything that had happened. Every step she took in the gallery now seemed to symbolize a newly won battle. Elizabeth felt a mix of emotions, including anger and sadness, but also a deep sense of purpose. The incident had not only revealed the prejudices that were still present, but it had also strengthened her resolve to continue fighting against them. With her bag finally secure on her shoulder, Elizabeth saw her bag on the desk, exactly where it had been left. Elizabeth raised her head and took one last glance around, taking in the beauty of the artwork all around her, as well as the possibility of justice and change. As she made her way toward the exit, every sculpture and picture seemed to hint to the possibility of a day when everyone may move freely from prejudice. Elizabeth caught the attention of a few guests, who treated her with a mix of respect and interest, possibly realizing the gravity of what had happened. Elizabeth was aware that by sharing her tale, others would be motivated to speak out against injustice. As they walked through the glass entrance door, Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling the strength of the moment, and took her first steps away from the gallery. As she walked along the sidewalk, as the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the busy street, Elizabeth felt the fresh air hit her face, serving as a reminder of the freedom she was determined to protect. Elizabeth's thoughts swirled, realizing that the incident at the gallery was only one small part of a much bigger struggle against racism and prejudice that many people had to deal with on a daily basis. Rather than being demoralized, Elizabeth felt energized by this realization, realizing that her fight against racism and prejudice was only getting started. As Elizabeth left the Norby Gallery, the scope of what had transpired there quickly became apparent, and I will not let up until everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. Elizabeth understood that her experience had the potential to have a significant impact, and that the incident was more than just a personal matter. It was a reflection of systemic injustices that needed to be addressed and dismantled. Every interaction, suspicious glance, and accusatory word were signs of a bigger issue. Her tale of adversity and tenacity served as a potent reminder of the necessity of opposing injustice in all of its manifestations. Racism and prejudice had to be faced head-on with courage and tenacity. They could neither be ignored nor tolerated. As Elizabeth talked, the room seemed to close around her, burdened by the weight of her experiences and the urgency of her message. We need systemic changes so that what happened yesterday shouldn't happen to anyone else. A sincere dedication to fairness and equality regardless of their identity or appearance. Every person entering this gallery or any other location deserves to be treated with respect. She hesitated, her voice full of passion. Elizabeth looked around, her eyes gleaming with profound conviction. I demand that you, Olivia, hear me. I am not merely a victim of discrimination. I am a voice for those who are frequently silenced. And I am here to make sure that my voice and the voices of many others are heard. The room fell silent for a moment as everyone took in Elizabeth's powerful words. James Henry and all those in positions of power take a serious introspection and consider how your actions and attitudes affect others. I demand that you commit to doing better, to being better. Elizabeth finished with a firmness that echoed throughout the room. We cannot change the past, but we can learn from it. And we can and must fight for a future where everyone is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve. It is our responsibility, and it is our duty. It was evident that Elizabeth's statements had rattled James and Henry, as they both began to consider the consequences of their conduct in the new light. Public Attorney Dr. Benjamin moved forward, ending the silence and speaking in a firm, authoritative manner. He confirmed what Elizabeth had said, filling the room with unwavering authority. It is our duty to treat people with respect and dignity. And when we fail to do so, we must accept the consequences. He turned to face Olivia, who was sitting quietly with her hands trembling on the table. As the gallery's curator, you should be an example of integrity and leadership. But instead, you justified actions that should never have been taken, and allowed discrimination to go unnoticed. Your failure to act appropriately not only hurt Elizabeth, but it also damaged the reputation of the gallery you lead. Elizabeth nodded slowly, her face displaying shame. I understand, she murmured in a regretful voice. I swear that this won't occur again, and I'll do all in my power to make sure that our gallery is a welcoming and respectful environment. Benjamin turned to face James, who was standing and attempting to remain composed. James, you have a responsibility to safeguard everyone. In your capacity as head of security, not only the artwork. Your prejudice and snap decision clearly abused your authority. Thus, it is critical that you reevaluate how you carry out your duties and receive extra training in ethics and human rights. Finally, Benjamin turned to Henry, who appeared even more uncomfortable with the situation. James bent his head, understanding the importance of his actions. Yes, sir, he answered, in a firm, quiet voice. I am willing to undergo any necessary training, so this will never happen again under my supervision. Henry, your actions were blatantly discriminatory. You acted with prejudice, and that is unacceptable. You must realize that everyone who enters this gallery deserves to be treated equally and with respect. Your security procedures will be thoroughly reviewed, and your job will be reevaluated. With a mixture of regret and resolve, Henry nodded. I understand, he muttered, in a barely audible voice. I will work to be better, to ensure this never happens again. Benjamin averted his eyes and looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth, you have showed incredible bravery and decency in the face of extreme injustice. Your remarks serve as a reminder of how crucial it is to fight for justice and equality. We'll take steps to make sure that this gallery and all of its employees are dedicated to these values, so your words won't be ignored. Elizabeth nodded, thanking Dr. Benjamin with a gleam of optimism in her eyes. I hope that this is a beginning in the right direction for everyone who might experience similar injustices in the future, not just for me. The public defender nodded, saying, We'll take specific action. This gallery will serve as a model for how to grow from our errors and create a truly egalitarian and respectful atmosphere. The conference came to a close, but everyone there still felt the impact of Elizabeth's words and Benjamin's deeds. It was the start of a dreary shift, and everyone realized that their responsibilities went beyond words to include deeds that would influence the future. With a mixture of relief and resolve, Elizabeth left the small meeting room. Her meeting with the public defender had been intense, but essential for realizing the injustices that had been committed. As she made her way down the gallery's corridor, the artworks that had once promised tranquility now served as a backdrop for her pursuit of justice. Elizabeth approached the reception area. Elizabeth hesitated for a while, grasping the bag firmly. As she thought back on everything that had happened, Seeing her bag on the desk precisely where it had been left was comforting, but it was also a tactile reminder of the humiliation she had undergone. Elizabeth experienced a range of emotions, including anger, sadness, and a strong sense of purpose. The incident had not only exposed the prejudices that still existed, but it had also fortified her resolve to keep fighting against them. Her bag finally safely slung over her shoulder. Every step she took in the gallery now seemed to represent a new battle. Elizabeth raised her head and took one last glance around, taking in the beauty of the artwork all around her, as well as the possibility of justice and change. As she made her way toward the exit, every sculpture and picture seemed to whisper about a time when everyone could live without facing discrimination. Elizabeth caught the attention of a few guests, who treated her with a mix of respect and interest, possibly realizing the gravity of what had happened. Elizabeth was aware that by sharing her experience, others will be motivated to speak out against injustice when it comes to the glass entrance door. Elizabeth took a deep breath, feeling the strength of the moment, and took her first steps away from the gallery. As she walked along the sidewalk, her reflections continued to swirl. The incident at the gallery was just one example of a much larger struggle, a constant battle against racism and prejudice that many people faced every day. But instead of feeling discouraged, Elizabeth felt invigorated because she knew that her voice was powerful and that her fight was just getting started. Elizabeth's eyes were filled with firm determination. As Elizabeth left the Norby Gallery, the scope of what had transpired there quickly became apparent, and I will not let up until everyone is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve. The incident with Elizabeth was more than just a personal matter. It was a reflection of systemic injustices that needed to be addressed and eradicated. Elizabeth knew that her experience could have a significant impact. Her tale of struggle and resiliency served as a potent reminder of the need to fight injustice in all of its manifestations. Every interaction, suspicious look, and accusatory word were signs of a bigger issue. Racism and prejudice had to be faced head-on with courage and tenacity. They could neither be ignored nor tolerated. Check out my channel for more stories like this. Kindly leave a thumbs up if you enjoyed this story, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and smash on the bell notification icon to get notified whenever I post new videos here. Thank you.